One divine liturgy is worth more than $1 billion. One may practice a multitude of virtues, but nothing compares to the mystery. One divine liturgy is worth more than $1 billion. In today's teaching, brothers and sisters, Gerontissa Makrina of blessed memory focuses our attention on the divine liturgy, its worth, and most of all, how we prepare for it, how we ready ourselves in order to exploit it and acquire this indescribable wealth for ourselves. And she begins by speaking to us about how we prepare for the liturgy and the divine services generally. At first, she focuses our attention inwardly as being the most important or essential part. How do we prepare ourselves spiritually then for the liturgy? We have to remind ourselves of just how special, just how important, just how miraculous a thing it is that we experience and live. Listen, she says, to how Elder Ephraim of Portaria felt about the liturgy. Recently, she writes, certain pilgrims visited our monastery who had traveled to the Holy Mountain. They told me about the holy state that Father Ephraim of Portaria has when he serves the liturgy. He kneels down and he rests his head on the altar table, unable to rise because of the fount of tears he sheds during celebration. He serves the liturgy with sobs. At the point in the liturgy where he says, "Thine own of thine own," he cannot raise his head because of his compunction and tears. Every time, in other words, he celebrated the divine liturgy, the elder wept, understanding, perceiving, experiencing the grace and mercy poured out and expressed in the mystery of Holy Communion. What we do then every Sunday and every feast is not then an everyday thing, even if it is celebrated every day, brothers and sisters. At every liturgy, in a mystical, incomprehensible way, our Lord God and Savior, Jesus Christ, not only comes to be present with us in his very body and blood, but he accepts to be divided without being disunited, that we might become partakers of him and united to him if we prepare worthily to receive the mystery. Think on that for a moment. Though enthroned with the Father on high, yet invisibly present here in our midst, deign by your mighty hand to give us a share in your pure body and precious blood. This is how the priest prays just before we receive Holy Communion. Also, Christ taught us, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. And within the divine liturgy, what he said here is presented before our spiritual eyes. This then is in no way an everyday thing. And if we're going to approach the liturgy and communion properly, if we're going to acquire its wealth, we have to keep this on our hearts and in our minds and never forget it, weeping for the glory and mercy, if not outwardly, at least inwardly in our heart, just like the elder Gerontissa told us about. But there is not only inner preparation, brothers and sisters. There is also outer preparation. And Gerontissa mentions a few notable things here in this regard. There was a priest, she said, who went to a clairvoyant eldress. Who is a clairvoyant? A clairvoyant is someone who God allows to see into the hearts for the sake of the salvation of souls. This is how Gerontissa recounts the event. A priest visited who wanted to meet her, this clairvoyant eldress, and she didn't know him either. The two had never met. The priest thought, since she is in the wilderness, I will take the holy gifts to commune her. I will also do an unction service. And as soon as she saw him, she said, "Welcome, Father John. Did you come to do an unction service for me and to give me Holy Communion?" "Yes, Gerontissa, I came to commune you and to do an unction service for you." "You are wrong in one thing," she said right away. The poor man stood still. Amazed, he thought, she is calling me by my own name, and she knows that I've made a mistake in something. There are, she says, some women who come to church with short skirts. You don't advise them not to wear such things." The poor priest felt shame, and he knelt down and stopped speaking. Now I myself am under this same judgment, but I delayed in speaking to you about such things because I was worried you were not spiritually mature enough to hear it. But now I know you are, and so I will speak. It does matter what we wear to church, brothers and sisters, and be assured that this principle applies equally to men as it does to women. The elders in this case mentioned women, but the principle also applies to men. We ought to come to church dressed how? Dressed modestly, so as not to become a distraction, especially at the par excellence hour of prayer. We want to avoid things that are, for example, maybe too form-fitting, and make sure that we are well covered up. Everyone is indeed responsible for their own eyes, for where they're looking, for controlling themselves. But as Christians, we have to remember, brothers and sisters, that we are also called to bear one another's burdens. That is, to do everything in our power to help our brethren on their spiritual path, because this fulfills the law of Christ. This novel attitude that we hear sometimes in the news from time to time, from school children and ignorant parents when they say, "It's my right to wear to school whatever I want. Forget how it affects everyone else around me." This, brothers and sisters, this attitude doesn't apply to us as Christians. It's not Christian. It is far from the gospel, which calls us to sacrifice our own comfort and own desires for the sake of our brethren. So on the one hand, Gerontissa reminds us to dress modestly through this story. But also she reminds us to dress well. Now that doesn't mean expensively. We don't have to go out and buy Armani suits in order to come to church. That would be ridiculous. But we shouldn't wear our workout clothes, for example, to church. We have to remember, it all goes into our mindset, how we think about church, how we think about what we're experiencing. We are coming to meet the King of heaven and earth. And dressing in church clothes helps us foster a mentality of honor and respect towards the place where we're going. If we wear the same thing we wear in our life every single day, church doesn't feel particularly special. But in terms of the mentality it fosters when we dress up, it reminds us that we're indeed going somewhere special and somewhere different. We're participating in something completely otherworldly apart from the rest of our life. Or beyond the rest of our life, rather. Now this even put me to thinking. Matushka has many times rightly tried to call to my attention something which I perhaps should have listened to. Sometimes when it's hot, I wear an old cassock, something that's a little bit ratty, because I think it's a little bit cooler. I do the same thing, or I wear a t-shirt instead of wearing a collared shirt underneath my raso, in order to be cool for the sake of comfort. Matushka was right to point this out to me. It would be better if I wore one of my best rasos, in order to foster the proper mentality in myself that I'm not just going around the streets. I'm going somewhere important and special. So that's just to tell you, brothers and sisters, when I say these things, when I speak these words from Gerontissa, I speak not only to you, but also to myself. Now from here, from how we get ready for church, Gerontissa turns her attention to how we act within the context of the services. From the blessed is our God, or blessed is the kingdom, through to the end of through the prayer of our Holy Fathers. So how we act in the midst of the services. First, she says, recognize what you're coming into the middle of, and the struggle of everyone around you to maintain a spirit of undivided prayer. You're coming into something very lofty, and at the same time, all the people you see around you are struggling to keep their mind focused on prayer and God. And therefore, it stands to reason, she says, that we should keep very quiet. Don't even whisper, she says, if at all possible, but instead communicate with gestures. Maybe sometimes we have to speak a word here and there softly, especially those of us who have children that we're trying to teach how to behave appropriately in church. But we should try to do more things, she says, with gestures than with speech in order to preserve the environment. You'll see this is exactly what happens in the altar. We have a very complicated task at times, but we try to do everything with gestures in order to maintain quiet and not to cause a disturbance and take someone of you out of prayer. Now, this especially applies if we come in maybe a little late for whatever reason. We should be that much more conscious that we're not entering at the beginning, but into the middle of a work that has already started. But once we are in, and we come to our place, to the place where we stand, what are we then to do? The stasidi, the place where you stand, symbolizes the tomb, Gerontissa says, and wishes to remind us. With great divine fear, let us stand, bow our heads, and have our mind on God and on prayer. When we come to our place, then, in other words, think, I'm standing before my tomb, my gravestone. These may be the last prayers that I offer in my life. Use this image, this remembrance, to add intensity to your prayer. If that space is my tomb set out before me, and that's where I'm headed, I better make these prayers I make now count. It's a variation of the same kind of thought that we hear our kids use. This is the very last week of summer. I better get everything done I want to do today or this week. I stand at the edge of my tomb. I better make this liturgy count. So when we come to our place and stand, think, this is my grave. I'm headed towards the grave. This liturgy has to count. My prayers have to be focused. Connected to this, Gerontissa next praises the act of standing in church. She says a lot about it, actually, perhaps a surprising amount about the importance of standing in church. We should stand, she says, as much as possible. Stand upright so that you'll be able to feel the prayer. So it helps in prayer. Standing, she adds, also helps a great deal so that the grace of God will come into the soul. How is this possible? How is it possible that some action calls the grace of God towards us? She explains. When someone stands in church, it's a spiritual labor. It's a struggle. It's a sacrifice for God. And God will overshadow him as a result of his struggle. Standing is then a spiritual labor and a spiritual struggle. It's a fight to subdue the body and its comfort, that nagging voice that says, sit down, sit down, sit down, make yourself comfortable. It's a fight in order to subdue that voice for the sake of spiritual ends. And therefore, because it's this kind of struggle, a spiritual struggle, it attracts grace. So we sit when it's appropriate, at the canons during matins, at the epistle, at the homily, as we do now at liturgy, but otherwise we struggle to stand. But Gerontissa was also wise to add, each in proportion to his or her ability. We don't look around and impose this standing on others. It is good for young ones who don't have an illness to stand in church, she says. But if someone is ill, he is, of course, excused. To each, then, according to his measure. Standing is a good thing, it's a good struggle, but it's not something we impose on anyone else. It's each according to his measure. And Gerontissa concludes with a very insightful teaching on drowsiness in church, what we might call, I guess, sleepiness. She categorizes this, brothers and sisters, as a spiritual phenomenon. Notice we can stare for hours at a television and not fall asleep. But when we come into church, a half an hour into service, we're bored. For 5 minutes into a homily, we start to fall asleep. She writes, why is it that as soon as we leave church, sleep departs, and our eyes immediately open and we begin talking? Well, at the hour of prayer, when we should be talking with God, we are overcome by sleepiness and listlessness, boredom. Why? Because the devil strives to hinder our soul from being united to God. It is then, brothers and sisters, a spiritual temptation. It is the evil one trying to rob us of something that is extremely beneficial. So what then should we do when this drowsiness, this sleepiness comes upon us in the midst of services? She says we have to recognize it for what it is, a temptation, and fight it. We can't say in our minds, we can't justify ourselves, oh, I must be tired, I was up late last night, whatever. We have to recognize this is a particular temptation associated with entering into prayer and the divine services. We have to recognize it for what it is and fight it tooth and nail, she says. We should pray the prayer rope when sleepiness fights us, because at the hour of prayer, the devil, she says, is looking to gain ground. Thus, it's very important for us to have a prayer rope on us to use during the Divine Liturgy and during the Divine Services. We listen for a while, the devil begins to fight us, our mind starts to drift, we get tired, then we start to say the prayer, which is easier to focus on, and this sort of wakes us up. And after a little period of doing the prayer, when we've called ourselves back to our senses, then we return to listening to the hymns and prayers again, and this cycle will probably repeat over and over again throughout the Divine Liturgy and throughout the services. Now, from all this, brothers and sisters, one thing should be absolutely clear to us. The Divine Liturgy isn't something to be entered into lightly. It's a spiritual arena. It's a battleground where grace is won and lost. Nor do we adjust the liturgy to make it easier on us. Rather, we struggle to adjust ourselves to it. Why? Why do we have to adjust ourselves to the liturgy and not the liturgy to us? Because in that adjustment, as Gerontissa describes, the soul is made ready to acquire grace and salvation. In adjusting it, or not striving to participate truly according to the advice Gerontissa has given us today, that grace and salvation is lost to us. Amen.